Chapter 15, First Line of Defense. The learning objectives for this topic are: identify the physical and chemical aspects of the skin that enable it to prevent the entrance of pathogens. Identify the locations of the body's mucous membranes. Explain how mucous membranes protect the body both physically and chemically. Describe the lacrimal apparatus and the role of tears in combating infection. Define normal microbiota and explain how they help provide protection against disease. Describe antimicrobial peptides as a part of the body's defenses. In this topic, we're going to be discussing the skin and how it acts as the first line of defense, the mucous membrane, also how it acts as the first line of defense, your normal microbiota, and other first line defenses. For the skin, let's first talk about its anatomy and how it acts as a physical barrier. Skin comes in two parts: the epidermis, which is the outermost layer, and the dermis. At the base of the epidermis, you have stem cells that produce lots and lots of cells continually. As these daughter cells move up to the surface, they flatten out. They produce more of a protein called keratin, which most microbes do not have the enzymes to break down, and they slowly die, so that when you hit the outer surface of the epidermis, you have a thick layer of dead, keratinized cells that are an effective barrier. Now, the dermis kind of acts as a support, literally and figuratively, for the epidermis. So you have blood cells that come and supply nutrients to the epidermis, and it aids in the epidermis being flexible and being able to move and all sorts of stuff. Most of the time, microbes cannot pass the epidermis to get to the dermis. The only time, most of the time, that they can get past the epidermis is when the epidermis is broken, either through scrapes, cuts, bites, and that sort of thing. Now let's talk about skin and how it acts as a chemical barrier. The first chemical barrier, if you want to think of it for the epidermis, is that it's very dry. And because of osmotic pressure, in other words, you have a microbe that has all sorts of water on the inside of it, and the skin that has very little water, water tends to want to move toward the skin or the area of low water. So that kills quite a few organisms. Now, the dermis produces quite a few chemicals that aid the epidermis in being a barrier. Let's start with the oil glands. Now, really, the main purpose of the oil glands is to produce sebum, or oil, which keeps the epidermis nice and flexible so it doesn't crack and break. But sebum also has a low pH, which inhibits the growth of most organisms or outright kills them. Also, sebum is full of other molecules called defensins that we're going to talk about in more detail. But think of them as our own little antimicrobials that we make. Now, over here is a sweat gland. Sweat glands are part of the mechanism that our body uses to keep us cool. When we're hot, we pump out water. It evaporates, which leads to evaporative cooling. They also have salt. And as the sweat dries, that salt deposits on the skin, also increasing the osmotic pressure on organisms living there. Now, as promised, the antimicrobials specifically, we're going to start with the defensins. So defensins are chains of about 20 amino acids, so they're really not big enough to be called a protein. Hence, that's why we call them peptides. And they have a tendency to do a variety of things, like they can punch holes in pathogens, they can interrupt internal signaling and enzymatic action of pathogens, and they act as chemotactic factors to recruit leukocytes to the site, which we're going to be talking about in the second line of defense. Now, the skin secretes a specific class of defensins called dermicins, and we don't really know what their mechanism of action is. Now, another antimicrobial protein is called lysozyme. We find lysozyme all over in the fluids of the human body, and it eats through bacterial cell walls by clipping those nag and nab subunits and peptidoglycan. Isn't that clever? And it makes bacteria easy for phagocytites to digest. Think of it as a meat tenderizer. Now, sebum, we already talked about sebum, but here's a nice review for you to take a look at. Now, the last thing about the skin are the, this is really a second line of defense, but dendritic cells. These are phagocytic cells that are in the dermis, and they send out thin pseudopods, if you want to think of them that way, in between the cells of the dermis, and they act as kind of a security net. And they are continually phagocytizing different things that come in. And this is non-specific phagocytosis. They will phagocytize dead dermal cells and anything that gets in from the outside. Later on, we're going to talk about how dendritic cells act as antigen-presenting cells to the cells of the adaptive immune system. Next, let's move on to the mucous membrane. The mucous membrane is mucus-secreting membranes that cover all of the body cavities that are open to the outside environment. So, in other words, that covers the linings of the respiratory tract, the GI tract, or that GI for gastrointestinal, the urinary tract, and reproductive tracts. So, here are the defenses of the mucous membrane, and we're going to talk about how it differs from the skin. So the mucous membrane also has very tightly packed cells, but they can vary from 1 to a few cells thick, as opposed to the several layers of cells thick of the skin. Also, the mucous membrane is moist, where the skin is dry. The mucous membrane is constantly shedding cells, just like the skin. Unlike the skin, live cells are shed. With skin, it's all dead cells off of the outside of the epidermis. The mucous membrane also has dendritic cells, but unlike the dendritic cells of the skin, which basically sit there in the dermis and have no contact with the outside world unless the skin is broken, dendritic cells of the mucous membrane are constantly reaching up to sample what's in the lumen, or think of it as the space that the mucous membrane is covering. So, say in your intestinal tract, they're constantly reaching up to take a little bite of the food to see what's in it. Now, the chemical defenses of the mucous membrane are pretty much the same as the skin. Defensins are being excreted. Oftentimes there is a low pH. Well, it depends upon where we're talking about. We also produce lysozyme that is in the mucous membrane, but we don't have sebum. Because the mucous membrane is moist, you don't need to have oils to keep it nice and flexible. Many parts of the mucous membrane have goblet cells and cilia. Goblet cells are the cells that actually produce the mucus. They're called goblet cells because they're shaped like a goblet. Mucus is sticky, so it traps particles, organisms, viruses, all of that fun stuff. And also we have chemical products like defensins and lysozyme that also inhibit the growth of microorganisms. But we don't want all of that sticky stuff lining, say, our respiratory tract or our gastrointestinal tract. So we have cells that have cilia, like in this micrograph. And the cilia sweeps the mucus out. So in the case of the lungs, the mucus is swept up and into the pharynx where it's either swallowed or up into the throat where it's coughed out. In either case, whatever's trapped in the mucus heads on out. Because of this one-way movement of the cilia, we have a tendency to call this the cilia escalator. Kind of a nice image, huh? Now, there are some parts of the mucous membrane that do not have goblet cells and cilia, and the eye is one of them. As I have here, you don't want mucus on or in or on the eye. Think of it this way. On your windshield, do you want big old globs of mud? No. In fact, you have windshield wipers to wipe that off, and you have windshield wiper fluid to help in the process of getting it off. Well, mucus is thick, viscous, and it's really hard to see through. So, just like mud on your windshield, you do not want mucus on your eye. And the windshield wipers of the eye are the eyelids. You blink from the outside to the inside, wiping tears, or in my analogy, windshield wiper fluid, so that the tears help wipe whatever's on the eye from the outside of the eye into the inside of the eye. This helps keep the eye clear, moist, nice and flexible. Now you've got tear glands or lacrimal glands up here on the outside corner, and you have various tear ducts or nasal lacrimal ducts that help conduct that into either the nose or into the sinuses and back down into the throat. Tears, besides physically removing microbes from your eyes, also contain lysozyme. Like I said, lysozyme is found all over the place. On to the normal microbiota. You can probably chant this off with me, but we're going to cover it again because repetition is good. So, normal microbiota act as a first line of defense for you through the process of microbial antagonism. In other words, they are antagonistic against transient pathogens in the following ways. They compete for space, so basically they're covering up your receptors so the pathogens can't grab a hold. They compete for nutrients so that all of the buffet dishes are empty by the time the pathogens arrive. They also produce antimicrobials and toxic byproducts. Some of your normal inhabitants of your mucosa, especially in the female reproductive tract and in the urinary tract of everybody, lower the pH through their byproducts, and this inhibits the growth of most pathogens. Also, they stimulate your immune system. Studies with organisms that have been delivered by cesarean into a sterile environment, and they're kept in a sterile environment so they never develop a normal microbiota, are called axenic. And it's found that they respond slower to opportunistic pathogens and pathogens than organisms that are xenic or have a normal microbiota. So be kind to your microbiota. Be nice to your old friends. They're helping you out. Now, let's talk about other first line of defenses. Let's talk about antimicrobial peptides again. The chapter brings them up twice, therefore we will talk about them twice. But here's some new material. First off, antimicrobial peptides, depending upon which ones they are, can be effective against gram-positive bacteria, gram-negative bacteria, protozoa, enveloped viruses, and fungi. So that covers most of what you're going to come in contact with. And in review, it's produced by your skin, your mucous membrane, and it's also produced by your neutrophils, which we are going to talk about in the next topic. And here's a reminder of what they can do. Lastly, let's talk about secretions that act in defense, but which is a secondary function. In other words, these secretions are performing some other function in the body. Let's cover two of them: stomach acid and urine. Let's start with stomach acid. The main function of stomach acid is to aid in the digestion of what you've been eating. You've got a low pH. It denatures proteins especially to make them easier to clip up by enzymes. But while you're denaturing the proteins in your food, you're also denaturing the proteins in microorganisms, and it inhibits most of them. Urine. The main purpose of urine is to get rid of the liquid waste of your body. But because it flows one way from your kidneys to your bladder, out through your urethra into the outside world, that one-way flushing physically flushes microbes out that may have entered the urethra from the external opening. Also, urine has a low pH just by the nature of the fact that it's urine. Then, like everything else, we toss in some lysozyme. So as you take a look at this table, you can take a look at all of these different things that have one primary function, but also perform another function in the defense of the body. Well, that's it for this topic, and here are some reminders of what the learning objectives for this topic were.